time as we have because school's out the day after tomorrow, so we don't have time for more than that. So what you'll hear is the opening statement. And those of you that are jurors have been asked to be jurors, and you're going to listen as impartially as any human being possibly can, which is not real impartial, but as best we can. Gotta get an amen. But as best that you can, and you are going to make a determination. We bagged it, Sean. We went to Plan C. It's all right. Thanks. Good stuff. So what we know is, although there's some conflicting information, there's some steady information that suggests that up to 80% of jurors make their decision in a civil case based on opening statements. The first part of the story, even if the case were to go on for weeks. So those of you that have been jurors have been asked to go ahead and make a decision at the end of when they finish their opening statement. And because the plaintiff brought the case to trial, the plaintiff starts. Remember, that's the team representing the last family. Then you're going to hear opening statements from the defense counsel, who will come up and tell their story. Then they get to come back with a little explanation or counter argument, counter opening, and then they finish. And then you guys make the decision. And we're thinking that it's probably going to take about 25, 30 minutes. Does it seem like it's going to take long? 20?
I said I have no idea.
Yeah, so in reading, Harper, 6 feet off of the ship, off, on the floor. And if you're not comfortable here, go ahead and leave. Because right now I got to take care of you. Just so you understand what I'm asking. So I'm going to play the judge, and my role is very minimal at this point. If there's an objection, I get to rule as to what is my option when I hear an objection. I can sustain the objection, which means what? The objection stays in place, or I can overrule it. Okay, so those are my two options. Any questions? Any needs? You ready? Remember how to turn it on? All right. Here. Judge Lorianne Mack, ready to hear the case of the blacks. That's right, you are supposed to stand up. You are supposed to, at the opening of the trial, you always stand up. That's sort of respect for the judge. And then, please be seated.
All right.
Yeah, they were supposed to rise too. All right, you ready?
Good afternoon, everyone. Now, imagine that something simple was stolen from you, such as your phone. You would be stressing and searching for this as soon as you realize that it's missing. But what if what you were searching for, what if it was a part of your own body that was missing? What if the people that you trusted with your body had misused that trust and decided to use your body for their own gain? This occurred many times in the 1900s when scientists would conduct many unethical studies where the scientists would use patients for their own research without informing them of everything that would occur during and after these procedures were done. This is what happened with Henrietta Lacks. She had been having severe abdominal pains and had found blood in her urine when she went to the bathroom. So she decided to take action and went to Johns Hopkins Hospital to seek treatment. It was there that she found out that she had cervical cancer. When at that hospital, Johns Hopkins called upon Dr. Wharton to conduct a procedure of placing tubes of radium on that tumor. However, unknown to Henrietta Lacks and unknown to her family, this was not the only procedure done that day. They also removed a piece of that tumor and gave it to Dr. George Guy, who owned his own lab and was free to do whatever he wanted with those cells. He was free to use them for research and manipulate those cells and distribute them across the country, while Henrietta was dying in that hospital. Her family had to watch her dying while her cells were living in labs across the country without their knowledge. Henrietta's children are here today to tell you the story of HeLa cells and how they came to be, and how they themselves had to struggle to find out this information. I would now like to introduce Stephen Franklin to inform you more about this.
We are claiming that Johns Hopkins Hospital had participated in unethical medical trials on the unconscious Henrietta Lacks. We will offer evidence supporting that Mrs. Lacks was never properly informed about any of the physical conditions that she would face as a result of this treatment. She was also never truly informed about the tests that had been done, as well as her family and what they were used for, as well as her family was never properly informed of the HeLa cells being distributed. They had no idea about the groundbreaking research that had taken place, nor the money that had resulted from it. This is mainly because they had replaced Henrietta's name with Helen Lane in order to hide her true identity. So her family had no access to any of the money. In 1951, that was the year that she died. 5 years prior to that, the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Human Rights basically state that it is illegal to have someone participate in a clinical trial without their informed consent. Obviously, Johns Hopkins Hospital ignored laws regarding consent or morals and ethics. In when Henrietta cells first underwent treatment, radiation treatment, she was never aware that she would have faced some of the physical conditions that she went through, such as her lower breast to her abdomen and her skin being charred, and her losing the ability to have kids. So 21 years after after her death, Henrietta after she had died, her family was asked, especially her husband, David De Lack, if it was okay for them to take cells from her cervical tumor, samples from them. The only permission that he gave was to let them take an autopsy on her, not a biopsy where they could take out tissue. So they couldn't remove anything. They had no right to. Before her death, they had taken samples from her cervical tumor without her consent, and after her death, without her family's consent. 21 years after HeLa cells were already cultured and distributed, her family finally found out what HeLa cells were used for. Dr. McCusick had asked Susan Hsu to ask his family for blood samples. And initially what they told the family was that they were being tested for cancer, when what the actual test was supposed to do was map out Henrietta's genetic background. So they misinformed her family about the proper use, about the use behind these samples, what they were using their blood for. Because they misinformed her family and they lied about that, this is genetic identity theft.
After the HeLa cells were distributed to many other laboratories across the world by Dr. George Guy, although Dr. George Guy did not financially benefit from the HeLa cells, many of these other researchers did benefit, and they did make money from the HeLa cells, and they did make money off of discoveries made that would not have been able to be made without these cells. Meanwhile, the family of Ms. Henrietta Lacks suffered from various severe medical conditions, many of which could be treated if they had had proper health care. For example, Ms. Deborah Lacks, a daughter of Henrietta Lacks, suffered from many medical issues, including but not limited to depression, severe anxiety, schizophrenia, osteoporosis, diabetes, and high blood pressure. Later in life, the high stress, from the reporters and the researchers aggressively seeking information from her and from the rest of her family about her mother, combined with her high blood pressure, resulted in multiple strokes that could have proven life-threatening. Another child of Miss Henrietta Lacks, Zakaria Rahman, he demonstrated severe aggression and anger as a result of abuse from his childhood that could have been treated with therapy that he did not have access to. All of the Lacks children suffered from impaired hearing, but many of them did not have access to hearing aids. Another son of Henrietta Lacks had a quintuple bypass in 2003, which sent him $150,000 into debt because he did not have health care insurance. We are not asking you, Johns Hopkins Hospital, for monetary reimbursements. We are instead asking for you to cover the health care costs of the direct descendants of Ms. Henrietta Lacks. This family does not have access to the health care that they so greatly need, and we understand that the HeLa cells proved extremely valuable in scientific exploration and scientific discovery. But we are only asking that Ms. Henrietta Lacks is memorialized through care for her direct descendants. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. I would like to ask that you deny the request by the plaintiffs for monetary payment by Johns Hopkins Hospital. From the founding of Johns Hopkins Hospital came a philosophy that the poor and minorities of the community near Johns Hopkins should never be turned away and treated with little to no payment to the hospital. Johns Hopkins was a non-profit organization formed to help the people of Baltimore, especially African Americans. The founder, John Hopkins, once said, "The indigent sick of this city and its environs, without regard to sex, age, or color, who require surgical or medical treatment, and who can be received into the hospital without peril to other inmates, and the poor of the city and state of all races, who are stricken down by any casualty, shall be received into the hospital without charge." These foundational concepts were still applied when a patient, Henrietta Lacks, in this case, walked into Johns Hopkins Hospital, hoping to find answers as to why she had a hard mass on the inside of her cervix. On January 29, 1951, Henrietta Lacks made her first visit to the gynecologist's office of Johns Hopkins Hospital. She was first examined by Dr. Howard Jones, who gave a diagnosis of epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix, stage 1, or cancer of the neck of the uterus. Richard Wesley Talinde took samples of the tissue from the cervical cancer of Henrietta Lacks, as well as tissues from other cervical cancer patients. Before she was admitted for treatment by radium, which destroys any cells it comes into contact with, including cancerous cells, on February 6th, she signed a consent form saying, "I hereby give consent to the staff of the Johns Hopkins Hospital to perform any operative procedures and under any circumstances, any anesthetic, either local or general, that they may deem necessary in the proper surgical care and treatment of," where she signed her name. Dr. Lawrence Wharton Jr. was the surgeon on duty for Henrietta's radium treatment, and he collected samples from her cervical cancer for Talinde and his research. While Henrietta Lacks returned home with radium inside her cervix, samples taken from her cervical cancer during the radium treatment were given to Dr. George Guy to grow in his laboratory with many other tissues. Mary Cubisek, Dr. Gay's lab assistant, cut Henrietta's cervical cancer cells into small pieces and inserted them into individual petri dishes used to grow cells with a nutrient medium or food source for the cells to grow. She then labeled the petri dishes HeLa for the first two letters of Henrietta and the last two letters of Lax. Her cells started to grow at a rapid pace, doubling every 24 hours. Excited by this, Dr. Gay told his closest colleagues that he may have grown the first immortal cells. And they asked, "Can we have some?" To this, George Gay replied, "Yes." Henrietta continued to receive treatment at Johns Hopkins, but gradually her condition declined until her cancer advanced into a terminal stage. The doctors and nurses administered pain medicine to ease her in her final days, but did not continue to treat Henrietta with radium or radiation therapy because it proved to be too much. Henrietta Lacks was told by Dr. Gay that your cells will make you immortal. To this, Henrietta said she was glad her pain would come to some good for someone. This interaction between Mrs. Lacks and Gay was seen by our witness, Lori Aurelian, colleague of Guy who worked at Johns Hopkins Hospital. The autopsy that was conducted upon Miss Lax's death followed all guidelines set by the family. The Lax's family told Johns Hopkins Medical Center that they would like Henrietta to be presentable for the funeral. And David Lax, Henrietta's husband, only granted Johns Hopkins Hospital permission for a partial autopsy. This meant that there would be no incision on Miss Lax's chest, and no removal of the limbs or head was permitted, as an invasive autopsy would have. The doctors were able to avoid making an incision on her chest by making the incision on her abdomen, and after the autopsy was finished, the doctor sewed her abdomen closed. There was no incision on Miss Lax's chest, and her limbs and head were not removed. The autopsy was performed by pathologist Dr. Wilbur and viewed by Mary Cubisek. I will now call Noah McGee up to give you a further story explanation for the history of HeLa cells.
The Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical standards for human experimentation, was produced as a result of the trial against several Nazi doctors who conducted experiments on prisoners during World War II. The code was based only on ethics, the branch of knowledge that deals with moral principles, and was never set into legislation or law. This allowed for doctors to decide what they felt was the right thing to do in certain situations. Johns Hopkins gave Henrietta's cells to Dr. George Guy to research cell culture and eventually join the fight against cancer. Hopkins believed that by giving the cells to Guy, they were advancing the common good. When the HeLa cells left Guy's lab and Johns Hopkins, they had no control over what was to happen to the cells in other people's possession. It was important to Dr. Guy, however, that the privacy of Miss Henrietta Lacks was protected during the sharing of scientific knowledge to other scientists. He did not disclose her name to anybody except for Mary Cubisek, who learned HeLa's true name from labeling cultures. She also did not release the name to any other source. Another important feature is that the culturing of cells is something that Guy wanted to be done to himself, so that he believed that it was a moral thing and it would advance the universe. Henrietta's cells related to many great biological discoveries in the middle to late 1900s. In 1952, the first polio vaccine was developed in a lab. However, problems arose due to a lack of test subjects. HeLa was found to be the perfect test subject because it was affordable and its rapid reproductive abilities left plenty of subjects. HeLa cells were also more susceptible to the polio virus than any other potential model. The use of HeLa cells in the polio experiments led to a proven and effective polio vaccine. HeLa cells were also the first human cells sent into space and were used to discover the true number of chromosomes located within a human cell. Companies that made profit off the distribution and creation of new HeLa cells did not include Johns Hopkins Hospital. Instead, a company created by Sam Reeder and researcher Monroe Benson, called Microbiological Associates, began mass producing and distributing HeLa cells to the public. This company was selling tequila cells and began profiting off it with no association to Johns Hopkins Hospital. Johns Hopkins followed all guidelines required by law at the time and adhered to the limitations laid out in the consent forms signed by Henrietta and her family members. George Guy and the workers of the lab distributed the cells grown from Mrs. Lax's tumor only to those who planned to study human disorders such as cancer and received no compensation for doing so. Johns Hopkins never received any money in exchange for tequila cells or related research and worked diligently to remain within the legal limits of the time.
Pull that down.
So as the defense stated, they did perform everything according to the guidelines set at that time. Yes, the Nuremberg Code was not necessarily law. However, the consent form that Henrietta Lacks signed nowhere stated that they would culture her cells in anywhere in that consent form. So technically, she never gave informed consent for her cells to be cultured. Also, there is no recorded record that Dr. Guy ever visited Henrietta Lacks. This is only hearsay from his colleague. So this is not feasible to use as solid evidence that Henrietta was aware of the fact that her cells were being used. Now, Johns Hopkins Hospital was indeed intended to be an equal opportunity hospital where all patients could receive care at an affordable price. However, the facilities were still segregated, separating whites from colored people, as according to Jim Crow times. And also, some people, especially the colored people, still could not afford their treatments. For example, Henrietta Lacks, when she was receiving numerous blood transfusions, had to stop receiving them because she owed money to the blood bank. Also, Sonny Lacks was in debt for $150,000 after his quintuple bypass. Now, if this hospital was providing this care at an affordable price, why is the family still in debt? So that is what the plaintiff says to the defense's opening statement. Thank you.
In the beginning, an analogy was given to how would you feel if your cell phone was taken from you? And then they asked, how would you feel if a body part was taken from you? Well, I don't exactly agree with that because it's not like a limb was taken.
That is a personal opinion, not that.
But I think
I would like to say what exactly was removed from her. That's what I'm getting at.
yeah. I'm going to allow it because of you guys making the connection to cell phone and a body part. So he's just counting that. So objection overruled.
To clarify, from the tumor, a small sliver about this big was removed. It was also said that Johns Hopkins gained something when they did not. There was no proof. It said that nothing was gained. It said that the form that was signed does not allow for the cells to be taken when there's so much in fact it does. Because Johns Hopkins followed all guidelines required by law of the time and adhered to the limitations laid out in the consent forms signed by Henrietta and her family. And I would also like to say a quote given by a man named Vincent, who was a He specifically says, in quotes, from the cells being removed from signs saying they can't be used anymore. He says, the impact that would have on science is inconceivable. As for the laxes, they have few legal options. They can sue over the cells being taken in the first place for several reasons, including the fact that the statute of limitations passed decades ago. They could attempt to stop field research through a lawsuit, arguing that it's impossible to anonymize the Henrietta cells which contain their DNA. But many legal experts I've talked to would doubt such a case would succeed. That's my opinion. The form was signed also. Money was gained off of Gila, but that was by a company called Microbiological Associates. John Hopkins made no money whatsoever. It sounded like about the identity. It was said that they shouldn't have concealed it. You seem kind of arguing against that. Okay. Well, they hid the identity because that's what you're supposed to do. That's regular medical practice. Why wouldn't they conceal it? It was also said she was part of a clinical trial, but I believe clinical trials are conducted on a living person, mostly given through something like a pill, seeing how it affects them, when she definitely wasn't. Her cells were, her cancer cells.
In addition to response to some of the facts given about the Nuremberg Code, it was not law at the time. However, it was designed for the National Socialist Party or the Nazi Party when conducting unreasonable surgical processes during recent times. It was never truly followed for the next 20 years. Also, the blood testing and drawing had no assessment of her current family had no association to the surgical process or the John Hopkins at all.
Objection, the doctors that took the blood samples worked for John Hopkins.
Sustained.
Could I add something? Okay.
I would like to pass the
There you go.
stage off to
That permission slip. The permission slip that was given, signed for the autopsy, also included in it that future blood testing would be allowed for samples. That's all I wanted to add.
That was not included in the consent form that Henrietta last time.
Are we talking about the consent form that Henrietta Lacks signed, or are we talking
No,
about
they
autopsy?
signed for the
About the-
autopsy.
so we're talking about two different forms here. Objection, overruled. You're fine. We have a couple minutes left. Do you have anything coming back? First one to the mic.
She drops it.
I'm gonna let you have a minute or two, and then they get one more little shot there.
So my first question for the defense would be, who exactly is Vincent? Okay, I'll leave that there. So,
Was it on your witness list?
Yes.
Sorry, that's on you guys.
okay.
So
Second,
I also explained it in my part.
you did.
second thing is, yes, John Hopkins did not make money themselves off of the HELOC cells, but other companies did make money as a result of Johns Hopkins sending them the cells. If Johns Hopkins had never taken the cells from Henrietta Lacks without her informed consent, none of these companies would have benefited from the effects of this study conducted with the cells. So it's essentially like the butterfly effect. So, as for the consent form that Henrietta Lacks signed, taking cells was not necessarily a part of her treatment. So she did not give consent for these cells to be taken from her. She only gave consent for the doctors to treat her for what was necessary, and taking these cells from her cervical tissue was not necessary for her treatment.
We have lawyers leaving because they have soccer games to go to. Sorry. All right, you guys want to?
Yeah, a few more quick
Good.
So, money was made off of the other companies, not Johns Hopkins. So I don't know why Johns Hopkins would be.
Objection. That is a personal view or opinion. I don't know why. Personal pronoun.
Johns Hopkins made no money, other companies made money. Please take that.
Does that satisfy the plaintiff that he's changed his wording? They're fine. Carry on.
Okay. If you're going to go so far as to use a butterfly effect, then you might as well go all the way back into Henrietta Edwards. There's no fact to that. And okay, assume these consent forms didn't give any permission at all. Would it really be that bad? If you could remove some cells to cure polio, do all this advanced research, you heard Vincent saying how much it would affect him, and it was at no cost to Henrietta. So.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and call it there. As you can tell, they get pretty connected to their side. Just so you know, they didn't pick their sides. They were randomly assigned sides. So if you guys can shake hands or hug or whatever, so that it's, and then somebody turn that mic off. And then,